Hi, my name is Akani Shimange, my pronouns are they and them, and today we'll be talking about non-binary people in media. I am a non-binary agender trans individual um, based in Johannesburg. I do work around SRHR issues, but more specifically around trans issues. As a non-binary person, I have a passion for what it looks like to do programming and to speak of non-binary people. I'm going to go through a number of definitions. So, sex being a biological term based on chromosomes, hormones, secondary and primary reproductive organs. Gender, which people use interchangeably with sex, is actually the experience of gender and not based on biological terms. And so you have transgender individuals who are assigned a sex at birth, and because we have attached sex to gender, there's an expectation of what gender they will become. Trans people grow up and say, actually, the sex I was assigned at birth is not my experience, and so there's no congruency between what they were assigned and who they are. Cisgender people are assigned a gender at birth and a sex, and they grow up and they agree with what they were assigned. So you're assigned male at birth, and as you grow up, you're like, yes, I am a boy. Non-binary people, we have continuously thought of gender and sex as binary terms. So it's either you're a boy or a girl, or you're male or female. Non-binary people either exist between gender, beyond gender, or find a way of having a very fluid identity that either encompasses both, not at the same ratio, it could be at the same ratio, but non-binary people do not fall neatly into the binary boxes of male or female. So, transgender, being an umbrella term, encompasses a number of identities. Um, the binary ones being the two that we have come to become accustomed with. So there are women and there are men. And so non-binary people, which then becomes another umbrella term, encompasses identities such as agender, which is someone who does not have a gender, um, gender queer, which their gender is different. They're human beings that dream themselves into existence. Third gender, which has been used in particular contexts, such as India, that actually has three gender markers, um, holding a space for Hajras. And so even when we speak of, I think there has been like a conflation of how trans is seen as an entire gender just by itself, and people have spoken as trans people as the third gender, but actually the third gender is the gender that is outside of the binary. So it would be non-binary people, but also that could then be brought down to other identities. Um, there are people who are gender fluid, whose gender basically fluctuates between the binaries, outside of the binary, and depending on how closer they feel to a particular binary, that's how they show up in the world. Gender variant, which has been used interchangeably with gender diverse, actually encompasses all individuals whose genders are not sitting within what is seen as the norm. So they are not cisgender usually, and they are they could be non-binary. They could just be women who are of trans experience. They could be men who are of trans experience. But because these genders are, I hate the word, deviant to what people have seen as the norm, they're seen as like a diversity of genders or a variety of genders. Just like all queer issues within the African context, there's continuously been conversation around non-binary people being like a Western concept. But as we move through the context of Africa, looking at West Africa's where they have Didis, who are individuals whose genders either changed as they grew up or they existed outside of the norms of gender. deities were seen as supernatural beings who are gods, and that speaks to basically the divinity of queer people and their ability to exist outside of that. We also house on a Southern African context. If one is a traditional healer or a traditional leader, they can house a spirit within their body that is not of the gender they were assigned at birth, and they can coexist with the spirit, moving through genders depending on which what they're doing, if they are themselves or are they at that moment representing the spirit that lives within them. There are a lot of historic stories within an African context of gender not being the main thing in how we identify people, but how they contribute to communities and societies. And that contribution has never been gendered, but represented by how much that was needed within a family. So, non binary people, like trans people, face an uphill battle in being legally recognized. Currently, on an African context, there are 3 countries in which you can change your gender marker to actually represent who you are, but also non binary. There isn't a country in Africa where you can change your gender marker to non binary. You still get forced to be one of the two, either male or female. Non-binary people are also not seen as valid. We have understood the world in a very binary lens, and the existence of non-binary people has been seen as this weird creation of a very global north idea of identities. Um, Non-binary people are also, even within queer movements, are highly misunderstood because queer movements have been seen from a very gendered lens. So we speak of lesbians who are women, we speak of gays who are men, and when we come to a space where there are people who are like, this is not our experiences of this life, it has highly been critiqued, but on a legal in a legal space, because there is no room made for non-binary people, regardless of what happens to us in the world, we cannot get any type of like redress, because how do you even open cases if you cannot be gendered in the ways in which people see you as gendered? We can Non-binary people are forced to perform a particular gender, to do basic things like use the bathroom, go to schools, write their driver's license test. Any version of participating in society has required non-binary people to basically um, exist as someone who they're not. Journalists have the tendency to not validate the identities of non-binary people. The story could be about anything, but the story will end up being about the fact that there was a they and them in the room. They and them being the pronoun that is used by most non-binary people, not all. There are non-binary people who are they and thems and he's and she's, but also the ways in which there is some sort of need to figure out what someone was assigned at birth, which invalidates their existence as they are in this moment. So journalists have this thing where, yes, we see you, but who are you really, right? Which is a true invalidation of someone's identity. Um, Journalists will misgender non-binary people, possibly 99% of the time. They will say, oh, I spoke to Akani and he says he's a they. And the minute I am then called a he, basically you have said, I am claiming to be a they. Um, Journalists don't speak, they actually don't speak of non-binary people. There aren't many stories across the world that speak of non-binary people without basically having to put them in these boxes for the comfortability of an audience and the discomfort of, um, I guess, the trans individual that would be sitting in front of you. And this does not just happen in stories, but it also happens in the death of trans people, and especially non binary people. We are then spoken about as what we were assigned at birth, invalidating basically our entire lives. So it is journalists misrepresent non-binary people in their life and in their death. True to how journalists kind of change the story when a trans person is introduced into the room. I've done a number of TV interviews that had nothing to do with my trans identity, but that ended up as the first 10 minutes of the conversation. Watching a journalist kind of ask questions and pose them in a particular way to kind of figure out what I was assigned at birth, and also understanding that what they're doing is more of a sensationalizing it, because if you can keep people watching the first 10 minutes, you can probably keep them the rest of the episode. But also this focus on not me as an individual, or also the topic that I was invited to speak to, but then focusing on what the doctor assigned me at birth and why do I look the way I look. So the tips I would give journalists is, and I always say this to anyone when introducing yourself to someone who is non-binary or you don't even know if they're non-binary, is to give your name. Hi, my name's Akani and my pronouns are. By you giving your pronouns, you have created a space for that person to give their pronouns immediately. So you have basically allowed them to tell you how they would like to be referred to. It is very important to not ask questions about genitalia or what people were assigned at birth, or because these questions can be triggering. Do not ask questions like, when did you know? Unless this is a conversation about the person being non-binary or being trans. It is actually irrelevant when people knew who they are in the world. Also, making the non-binary person the story when the story was never about the non-binary person. If they're a source to a different story, treat them like every other source. Basically, there is no need to end up at asking them very uncomfortable questions that are actually not relevant to the story that you're telling. And also, if there are questions that are trans-related or non-binary related, getting their permission first before asking the questions. That are they comfortable with you asking questions? But also opening space that if at any point they feel uncomfortable, even if they have given a yes initially, they are allowed to actually stop the conversation. And so that allows that non-binary person to firstly trust you, to be in a safe space, but also to be able to control where the conversation goes. If if the story is about being non-binary or about being trans, it is also important to run the story past them before publishing it, because the misrepresentation of trans people and of non-binary people has led to violence and even death of those individuals. So it is very important for those stories to be something they can stand behind and not the story that is sensational and sells the most. Introducing the individual as their name and saying who uses they them pronouns and not those that we are accustomed to he she pronouns. So it already does for the other person's brain to put they them in the space of he she, but also doesn't then require the explanation of what pronouns are or why this person uses they them pronouns. It then you can then jump into the story without having to basically go into their entire life story to explain pronouns. The lack of representation and good coverage of non-binary people in media has led to those particular individuals continuously feeling like outcasts, but also feeling so alone in the world. The media has a huge influence in this. The misrepresentation of non-binary people, when read by other non-binary people, is also really difficult to process as a person, but also to not personalize when reading it. So it is important for journalists and people in media to represent people truly as who they are and see their humanity outside of the sensational story. Thanks for watching.